Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mailbox for the 20th of August 2012. My name is TotalBiscuit, bringing you your daily dose of community interaction, gaming discussion, and all that good stuff. You can email in mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, that's mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, with topics for future shows. The game in the background is Team Fortress 2. Wow, I haven't played this, I think, since the show match that I did with Notch and all those guys. I'm pretty sure that it was that long ago. Ooh, well, I put it back on my machine because I wanted to try Man vs. Machine, which unfortunately is having a few problems for me at the moment. I can't buy anything from the store because the Steam store seems to think I'm still in the UK. Eventually I'm sure I'll have a day with Steam that doesn't involve me screaming at it, but it won't be today. First email comes in here from T-Dog Laquel. Wow, what a name. It says, in light of your recent video on Darksiders 2, I had a thought I wanted to relay to you. I personally think you are being slightly unreasonable regarding the graphics quality of Darksiders 2. I just don't think you are seeing the big picture. Granted, the game is a PC port, but what exactly distinguishes this from other games? In my view, it's the great art design, fun and diverse combat, and a storyline that's more interesting than your average soldier on a mission shoot-'em-up. I've heard a lot of opinions regarding Darksiders 2 and how developers should cater equally to both PC and console users, but that is more than often impossible due to the sheer difference in platforms. A good example of a port was Sleeping Dogs, which in the end is very different from the style of Darksiders. It's more based on view distance and the decor of Hong Kong, while Darksiders is based on the movement of the character, fighting and how smooth the flow of combat actually is, which I think it achieves successfully. Do you honestly think that just because someone has a high-end PC, which can successfully run a game to perfection, they should get their own separate, higher quality version of graphics for a game that was initially meant for console, but which in the end is perfectly playable on PC? Doesn't this sound like entitlement? I'd like to hear your views on this. It's good that someone emailed in about this, because I've been thinking about this for quite some time. Ever since I put that video out, I was reading some feedback and I was thinking, am I actually wrong to say that elements of the port aren't very good because of the low-resolution texture work? Is it okay to say that? Does that make it a bad port, or does that make it a faithful port? Even if it is a faithful port, is that acceptable for PC users, and what exactly are we entitled to, legitimately, rather than what we think we're entitled to, which of course makes us entitled gamers and blah blah blah. I'm sure you know the issue on that. It is a legitimately difficult topic to actually grasp. I own an expensive PC. There are many others that own expensive PCs. There are also many others that own cheaper PCs. But one way or the other, it's not hard to get a PC that's more powerful than a console. Consoles are 7 to 8 years old now in terms of their tech. You can buy any mid-range or even lower-range PC that will perform up to the standards of a console. So 720p, 30 FPS with similar kind of texture quality. Of course, to crank it up even higher than that, then you need a much better machine. But the question is, does buying a more expensive machine entitle you to a better looking game? Well, in theory, it does. And there are many things that you can do in order to make the game look better without having to redo all the assets. The first example, of course, is anti-aliasing. What is that all about? Well, it essentially smooths out the edges of objects. Back in the days of the PlayStation 2 and early PlayStation 3, hell, there are still some games to this day, there was something called the jaggies. What is that? Well, it's just the jagged edges of character models and actual parts of the world. Why is it like that? Well, it's simply because you create the model, but you don't have the processing power to smooth it out. Smoothing out is actually a rendering effect. It's post-processing, as it were, and it requires additional CPU and GPU power. Another example is anisotropic filtering, which is designed essentially to smooth out the transition between textures which are close to you and textures which are further away. Needless to say, further away textures will have a lower resolution, and without anisotropic filtering, that becomes very obvious. You get a very blurry texture quality at medium to far distance. With anisotropic filtering, what you can do is smooth that out, and you don't get those kind of effects and such a crazy and obvious transition between the two. Now, neither of these were available natively in Darksiders 2, which is kind of annoying because those are pretty standard features in most modern games. It's hardly a new technology either. This is not a new thing, and indeed, anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering are getting iterated. They're getting improved as we go along. We have all kinds of AA. We've got FXAA, the brand new TXAA, MSAA, yeah, all sorts of different acronyms that you really don't need to know about. These kind of features should be in PC ports because they are post-processing and they will allow you to use the additional power of your machine. Now, you can, under certain circumstances, apply those effects without them being native to the game, but more often than not, it is problematic. If you use something like SMAA Injector, for instance, you can force anti-aliasing into the game, but it comes at a very high system cost. SSAA, for instance, is one of the most inefficient forms of anti-aliasing available, if not the most. So it's difficult. You can try using driver hacks, but they have problems as well. Currently, there's no profile for Darksiders 2 on NVIDIA cards, so there's no way you can force it in that way either. Yeah, it's a joke. It really is a joke. That kind of thing should be in, without question, and I don't think it's entitled to ask for that. The problem comes not when we're talking about things like screen space ambient occlusion, MSAA, and all sorts of stuff like that, when we're talking about texture quality. Aesthetically, I would say that Darksiders 2 is one of the most beautiful games I've seen in a very long time. There is some great, if somewhat derivative, design in that game. The art designers showed excellent creativity and were able to realize their vision with a fairly stunning sense of scale and grandeur. However, it is, without a doubt, one of the ugliest games in terms of texture quality that I have seen in quite some time. For me, bearing in mind I use a monitor just like everyone else does with a PC, and I sit quite close to it just like everyone else does with a PC, texture quality is a big deal because it's very easy for me to see bad textures. If you're playing on a television half the room away, it's much more difficult. The game runs at 1080p, but the textures are clearly not 1080p resolution. They are far, far lower than that, and it becomes blindingly obvious that that is the case. Is it reasonable to expect higher resolution textures on PC? Sleeping Dogs provided an HD texture pack in order to increase the texture resolution. Darksiders 2 did not. Darksiders 2 was designed for console, as you accurately pointed out. And this is the real problem. Games that are developed for console as the primary platform and then ported to PC will most likely not be up to the standard of PC gamers. For me, I have to say this. It makes much more sense to develop for PC and then port to console than the other way around. Why? Because you build with higher quality textures in mind, and then you reduce the resolution of the texture for the console version as required in order to get it to perform correctly. That is, of course, a gross oversimplification, but you get the idea, right? If you're developing for PC and you know that it can run with higher quality textures, then why not develop with that platform in mind and then port and downgrade rather than try to upgrade? Surely one is quicker than the other. Thing is, the PC market just isn't really big enough to justify that, and there aren't a lot of companies that do it. There are a few. Capcom is actually one of them, if you can believe that. The MT framework is an engine designed to run on PC. They make the games for PC and then essentially port them to console. Dumb thing being, of course, that some of those games never see the light of the PC, even though they were developed on the MT framework engine. Dragon's Dogma and Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 are examples of games developed on the MT Framework version 2.0 engine, however, they were never brought to PC. However, the question still remains. Is it okay to say, this game is not up to my standards as a PC gamer because the texture quality is the same as a console? Is that an unreasonable thing to ask for? I do not necessarily believe that it is. I really don't. I believe that it is right to criticize a game if that game is held back as the result of limitations of hardware which you yourself are not actually using. Am I concerned about what the console version looks like? Honestly, not really. I primarily game as a PC gamer. I'm concerned about what the PC version looks like. I suppose the equivalent would be saying, oh, well, you're playing on a 360, you can't expect that to look any better than the Wii version. Well, yes, you can. It's a more powerful piece of hardware. You don't get the same texture quality on a Wii as you do on a 360 or PlayStation 3. By that same token, I would not expect the same texture quality on a PC, assuming I had the horsepower to actually render those textures, as opposed to on a 360 or a PlayStation 3. I think Darksiders 2 stood out for me as one of the most brazen examples. It's also much more obvious to see those problems as a result of the aesthetic of the game. The aesthetic of the game is often very clear, it's got some very sharp contrasts in it, and as a result you can very easily see if some texture work is lower resolution than you would expect. I honestly think it's probably not okay to say it's a bad port because the textures are the same quality. I think it's okay to say, oi, can you do better next time? And it's certainly okay to criticize what I would see as poor texture resolution. I don't believe at any point that I said the port was a bad port as a result of the texture quality, but what I will say is that I would hope that in future releases, the texture quality will be better. There are a checklist of features which should be in your PC port that, if lacking or working incorrectly, can be considered to constitute a bad PC port. I do not think texture quality is one of them, but it does indicate a certain lack of effort on the part of the developer. When games like Sleeping Dogs can come out with an HD texture pack on day one has to wonder why bigger releases like Darksiders 2 cannot. When all is said and done, I think honestly I'm just bitter that we've been stuck in this console generation for so damn long, and it's been holding back designers' artistic vision as a result. Do you really think the art designers wanted to have that low texture resolution? Absolutely not. They want their vision to be realized in the best possible quality. And they can't do it because we're stuck with old-ass hardware and we're still waiting for the announcement of new stuff. If PC was the dominant AAA gaming platform, then this would not be a problem. Unfortunately, it is not, and probably won't be for a while. And you know what? That annoys me. Sue me. I don't like it. Well, this is one of those occasions where one question drags on a little bit too long, so let's try and get one more in. This one comes in from Something Evil. It says, I recall you criticizing Spec Ops The Line's trailers and advertising as portraying the game as just another taxi lol dude bro shooter by numbers. However, in light of Camster's recent Errant Signal video interpreting the game as a commentary on the shooter genre in general, that advertising takes another meaning. It is deliberately disingenuous, making the player start the game with certain expectations that, while fulfilled from the game mechanics point of view, are contextualized in quite likely an extremely unexpected, potentially unpleasant way for the player via the narrative and the event triggers in the level. Another game that can be considered as having disingenuous mechanics and especially aesthetics in the context of the story is Braid, considering its twist endings. But given its other twist ending, one may perhaps criticize it for being too artsy for its own good, with nothing of substance beyond it, instead of the critical genre deconstruction that The Line is. While I understand that this kind of lie by omission could be good in getting gamers to try things and ask questions that they otherwise wouldn't, my question to you is how far can you go with advertising the game in a way that can be interpreted as disingenuous to its context before the, well, this wasn't what I wanted to play, but since I already have it and the disc is in, I might as well, sunk cost fallacy is used to the consumer's detriment. Well, that was far too well written, but there you go. Alright, well, I think you've answered a lot of your own questions there, but the interpretation of Camster is probably correct, I would imagine. I think that the game very much does take shots at the traditional shooter, but does so in a really weird way. It's not actually that self-aware. Now, I'm not talking from a storyline point of view, I'm talking from a game mechanics perspective. It's really difficult to criticize the standard by-the-numbers third or first-person shooter when essentially all of your mechanics are exactly that. For all of its strengths, Spec Ops is not that great a shooter. It's average at best. The only thing, really, that Spec Ops actually does that's more innovative than the average third-person shooter has got to be the way that it deals with sand in the game. Sandstorms, and the ability to collapse sand on people. But even then, you could view the collapsing sand on people as another standard, oh, there's an object in the level I can interact with by shooting that will fall down. That is not new, that's been done in an awful lot of different things. Hell, I could go as far as to say that Inversion actually has more innovation in it than Spec Ops does. For a game that claims to be such a critique of modern shooters, it certainly doesn't critique the mechanics very well. In fact, it falls into many of the same traps. And you could say, oh, well, it's doing it ironically, but I'm sorry, irony and gameplay mechanics should not mix. We're not looking to make a statement here. This is not a little indie game. We're not talking about The Graveyard, for instance, or The Path, or Dear Esther. We're talking about a full-on AAA release, and as a result, the mechanics have got to be up to scratch. And they are barely up to scratch. They are decent. They are average, run-of-the-mill, 5 out of 10. What carries the game, of course, is its aesthetic. The setting is absolutely phenomenal. And the storyline and the way that it tells the story and introduces you to some, quite frankly, very horrific and dark things is almost peerless. In fact, I would go as far as to say that it is peerless. I can't think of a single straight-up third or first-person shooter that does it that well. Now, on the subject of the advertising, I think that is not the kind of thing you really want to be doing. I would not be playing games with consumers. I just want to point out that Spec Ops The Line has not sold amazingly well. That is really unfortunate. I hope that when it goes on sale on Steam, people will turn around and after hearing so much praise about the story and the way that it actually carries itself as a narrative, they'll think, okay, I'm going to try this. I'm going to push past the fact that it's an average third-person shooter and look at what it really is. This emotional and, quite frankly, very dark journey and analysis of warfare. But is it okay not to convey that? Is it okay to say to your consumer, this is a straight-up shooter, blah, 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 you're going to be blowing stuff up? Well, I think in the case of Spec Ops, you might be able to get away with it because all that stuff is in the game. It's not like you're lying about the game. Yes, there's a lot of shooting, there's some explosions, there's some scripted sequences, there's some cutscenes, it's set in Dubai, you can see all this stuff in the trailer, and that's okay. But, as you pointed out, it's lie by omission, it's what it's not showing that's kind of a big deal. I think when you go that dark with your game, you might want to at least give people an indication that that's what you're planning on doing with it. There are a lot of games these days that have gone beyond simply being about gameplay. It's also about telling a story and evoking certain feelings in the player. One of the simplest feelings you can evoke, of course, is horror, fear. That's easy enough to do, we've been doing that for quite some time, but other emotions, not so much. I think that when you are going into a place that is dark, disturbing, depressing and upsetting, which is what I would describe several moments of Spec Ops: The Line as, then you really should at least be giving some indication of that in your trailers. And honestly, it's a selling point. It really is. Why is it that Spec Ops never advertised itself as a gritty and mature gaming experience? Because that's really what it is. Spec Ops is one of the most mature games I've ever played. I think that it is to a minor degree disingenuous not to communicate that, but more importantly, I think that it is very stupid from a marketing perspective not to communicate that, because there are many gamers that have been looking for that. There are a lot of older gamers that want that kind of experience, and they're not getting it in mainstream AAA releases. So why on earth would you go out of your way to pretend that your game wasn't that? Your marketing should not be some ironic statement about the state of the games industry. It's supposed to sell your bloody game. And unfortunately, it didn't do that well. And that concerns me, because then we might not get more games like Spec Ops: The Line. So slap, stop trying to be clever, and tell us what the game is. Okay, folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Mailbox. I will see you next time.